Thomas Heise, his work has been published in Plowshares, The Canary, Columbia, a Journal of Literature and Art, Modern Fiction Studies, 20th Century Literature, and numerous other journals. He is an associate professor of English at McGill University and divides his time between Montreal and New York. We should all be so lucky. Thomas Heise, everyone.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to Mike for having me here. If at any point I need to take a sip of my never-ending cup of sangria, I'm going to do the Marco Rubio thing, and I won't lose eye contact with the camera and make sure that I'm always focused on that. You know what I'm talking about, right? This is a response to the State of the Union address. So I'm going to read from this new book called Moth, or How I Came to Be With You Again. And it's an elliptical and fragmented novel slash memoir about a first-person narrator who is sort of navigating his unique situation where he has involuntary recall, where moments of his past in an orphanage, moments of his past with his mother and his father, who are distantly remembered, sort of flash forward and cause sort of unsettling moments in the present. And in the present moment, he's on a kind of peripatetic journey that takes him from Copenhagen to Berlin to New York to Moscow to Prague. And he's sort of motivated by some kind of unfulfilled desire that isn't exactly named. It's sort of an object of desire is sort of there in front of him, which sort of motivates his journeys and his searches. So he's sort of caught betwixt and between the past and the present. So I thought I'd sort of set up the book by reading first one of the epigraphs and then the opening section and then two sections later in the book. So an opening epigraph from Proust. I'm sad, not because you're leaving, but because I'm going to forget you. At some point in the winter of 2009, I became aware that I've been afflicted for years with a strange, unclassified condition that makes my experience of time markedly different from that of others. I hesitate to use the word illness since there's nothing pathogenic about which I write, the viral properties of language itself notwithstanding. The river of my memory, my own past, and that odd concept we call the present, which is ever in the process of being added to the detritus that is by common agreement a sign of life, flows in many directions. I have always had a hazy understanding of my own history, who my parents were, where I have come from, where I'm returning to. But in the months I was under the care of doctors TW, FW, and TR, I was told the liminal region between what was real and what was not had become for me indistinguishable, a mere phantom. All evidence to the contrary, I did not know whether to believe them, for they took such an unusual interest in my case that at times I wondered if they might not be diagnosing themselves. As I stared up at their faces leaning over the bed those days that blurred into weeks before my release last season, they often had the look of those who gazed for too long into the pond of Monet's water lilies. Days of sleeping alternated with spells of insomnia, which were interrupted by periods when I did not know if I were awake or dreaming because the images and ideas that appeared in my mind were often so unfamiliar that I half suspected they were beamed in as a radio signal from a distant shore or emerged up out of the seabed of a primordial life I had once lived, had all but forgotten, and whose vestiges on occasion made themselves known. I became lost in time and in retrospect lost in words. The moments of involuntary recall during which the unrecoverable past piling up behind me were only matched by the expansive field of time that even now remains barren in my memory. Fortunately, I am told that the rubble will wear down to a fine particulate mist that the winds of the imagination will scatter, like the storm blowing in from paradise for Benjamin's angel who cannot close its wings. Was my life now a second life, and my life in writing a third? I simply do not know. Talking is no cure, neither is writing, despite what the poets say. This disclosure provides no special insight, only a few planks of wood over sinking sand. Thus, it is only to those curious about the facts of a writer's life and the serendipitous nature of the act itself that I should mention in passing that this manuscript was originally composed by hand, and in the German during the time of my sickness and the months after. For some time the manuscript had gone missing, accidentally disposed of, or perhaps purloined, I thought, until one day I found it concealed behind the lining in my suitcase. Upon rereading it for the first time in many months, I became suspicious that parts of it had been altered and some parts entirely changed. I wondered, indeed, if I had even written it. Translators often remark that the intimacy in carrying a writer's words from one language to another is a communion unlike any other. And so I began translating the manuscript into the English until it was complete, and then out of a competition with myself now, or whoever I was then when I conceived those words, I birthed the original, T.H. Winter 2012. What I do not wish to reveal will be discovered anyways, because I will invariably tell it by leaving it out of the record. Such is how desire works. So consider this: 35 miles north of Copenhagen, on a morning of washed out light that is not uncommon in the region in April, I was following at an ever-increasing distance for the space of an hour a Middle Eastern woman in her 30s through a field of heather stretching for acres, which were full of grouse that rose up in a great clattering confusion as I waded through, as if I had aroused them from a sleep that had lasted all of their lives. She wore a white dress of muslin and intricate lace resembling a sail wrapped about her shoulders, and unlike myself was able to walk noiselessly through the field without a disturbance, leaving no trail behind her, as if her feet were floating through the heather. Glancing once over her shoulder, she lifted her veil, and I saw on her face a sense of wonderment, the way a parachutist looks back before leaping into the ether. Then she disappeared over the hillside. By the time I reached the crest, she was nowhere to be found on the slow undulations of purple and marble green, ending with a collar of fog on a desolate stretch of seacoast that seemed so cheerless and heartbreaking a place as to be all but uninhabitable. The abandoned lighthouse, plywood in the windows, each with an X on it, conveyed as much. Neither the longer odyssey by which I had arrived at this scrub of dirt and brush and windswept trees, nor the place I first set sight of her, in a vegetable market or at a petrol station or by a bell tower in a town square, had left any residue by which they might be traced backwards, recovered, or recalled without fabrication. But this knowledge by itself would not stop me from trying. Without realizing it, I had fallen for some months into the practice of following women through Copenhagen, which lent my otherwise aimless walks a purpose apart from passing the time before sleep. It was often the case that I would walk the distance of several blocks, sometimes a kilometer or more, into an entirely different quarter of the city before I became aware I was, as if on autopilot, keeping pace with a woman threading her way through a crowd late for lunch, or a business meeting, or, as happened once, back to her apartment building, where, catching the door of iron roses right before it closed, I followed and turned into an interior courtyard at the last second, as she ascended the stairs to shower or sleep or talk on the phone or wait for her lover. I had no way of knowing. I rested for an hour while I stared at the crumbling stones and up at a parcelled sky on a soundless day through which, miraculously enough, a zeppelin glided overhead like a mechanical whale, and I was convinced for a moment it was 1901 again, and everything and everyone would be okay for a while. I would never speak to these women, maybe 100 or more in total, and I would take caution to hang back a few meters to feign a casual coincidence, but close enough to breathe a trail of perfume, realizing any recognition would prematurely end the spell I was under and wake me to the ruins of the day. I can only speculate upon what drew me to them, other than they walked with an assurance and direction that each step carried them into a future self-determined and entirely their own, while I myself felt each year recede into the past, like a broken ice shelf, and on its drift the explorer, who having found what he wanted, refuses to leave. By the time she would enter an elevator or rendezvous with a companion, which I took to be a signal that my pursuit was over, I would invariably find myself leaning in the doorway, hastily transcribing her height, weight, hair color, son ablement, the shape of her earrings, and then I would invent a name fitting for her, lines scrolling down my pages. Consulting my notebook, I could confirm the evening before the woman disappeared through the heather I had slept in the Inn Bonne Espérance. And though I had no appetite despite having not eaten more than 36 hours, had alone taken a dinner of melon, roasted salmon, white tea on a heated patio, decorated with holiday lights strung in a few potted begonias, and had spoken briefly with the elderly keeper who, so barely animated, he seemed to have survived his own death, and was now biding his time and proceeded precisely at 9 to show me my room. It was strangely adorned with two antique diverging mirrors that were meant to open up the claustrophobic quarters, but which instead created a debilitating sense of disorientation, as if space around me were beginning to bend. That night, the simplest movements became a trial. Each time I would cross the floor for a glass of water or to retrieve my wallet, multiple versions of myself appeared out of unfathomable recesses in the mirrors, converged in the center and then dispersed. One turning a corner back into the corridor that now seemed to lead to the basement. Two others climbing perpendicular up the walls in different directions, a fourth hanging from the ceiling as I paused. All of this induced a paranoia that I had begun to project onto any surface reflexive of my desire to be seen. I was nauseated, as I always felt when looking at an MC Escher lithograph, which now I was sure I was in danger of becoming trapped within, and so exiting the room with care, I ventured downstairs to find the owner, to request another accommodation, but to judge by all the open doors, he, along with two other guests, a Jewish couple traveling to Munich, seemed to have departed. It was only later I learned from reading on an early period of European demonology that convex mirrors were an effective tool for ridding a room prone to unfriendly spirits. It was not the haunting I felt, then or now. Not precisely, unless you can haunt yourself, the former life crawling out of the dead leaves and soil. As I gather my thoughts like the threads of a tapestry, the window I stand in surveys the city's aquamarine office towers, populated with accountants, financial analysts, insurance underwriters, whose lives, which make ours possible, I cannot begin to imagine. And a few meters down below is a cemetery of mature oaks, a storage house enshrouded in such ivy to remove it would cause the roof to cave, and perhaps 100 tombstones tilted on a slope that steps down to a small river popular with mallards in summer. I know nearly nothing of those buried in the family plots and sepulchres whose eroded inscriptions I can almost read on a clear, dry day with a pair of opera glasses. Lives given in battle, victims to cholera, death by isolation, stillbirths, and race suicides. I was once informed graveyards old as this no longer have bodies in them, only names, and the sun in the branches and an inkling of the future robins bring. Twice a month, in late afternoon, two nuns appear, though I never see their arrival, to repair a broken link in the fence, pruning underbrush around the mossy stones and prepare a small size bit of dirt on the wrist, which gets smudged on her forehead and suddenly it's Ash Wednesday, and the sky is unfolding, and they have gathered leaves into a wicker basket in the medieval lanes with the dedication of a gardener poised before the fragility of his orchids. White moth, flower of San Sebastian, mother pearl, Apollinaire, tiger, hider of the north. The town where I had passed my childhood was a favorite subject of my memories, about which I could dwell, even luxuriate for hours while lying on a couch alone in an empty house bereft of furniture, or while sharing with my analyst, which I often did with my eyes closed. So it seemed to her I was talking in my sleep, and the long monologues that streamed out of me without any urging as I reclined on her sofa, imagining it were a raft, flowed from an underground river, whose source, I like to think, was the icy meltwater of Norway's Ostafana Glacier. But over years, these memories became more infrequent, and my efforts to conjure them by poring over sepia-toned photographs of bridges or schoolrooms filled at first glance with identical children quiet at the desks, or by holding in my palm a porcelain brooch of two young Victorians walking horses beneath two sycamores were to no avail. Then one day I recognized the transports of my wonder had left me behind, and the prospect of remaining forever trapped within the crystal of the here and now was enough to usher in the most severe depression. The small cache of talismanic objects I'd acquired over time and carefully guarded included, in addition to the photos and brooches, distress maps of various cities in Europe, elaborate corals, pigeon feathers, a woman's silk ribbon in purple, 2 miniature masks worn by monkeys during itinerant countryside theater performances in 19th century China, and a boy's diary with a cross on its cover secured with a tiny rope. Relics of other past, they bore no true connection to my youth. The items were purchased at estate sales and antique stores during the migratory period of my early 30s. I had chosen them out of a disorderly array of possibilities, the sheer randomness of abandoned objects, as evidence of an invented childhood, plot devices, if you will, whose fictional quality assumed a truth I could barely deny. I could recall little of my life before the age of puberty, and so, to compensate for the honeycomb structure of my brain, I took to assembling a glass and teakwood cabinet where at night displayed items were aglow from spectral electricity emanating out of things torn from their context, a quality witnessed in the oddly bright eyes of tropical birds forced to live indoors. Whenever I moved from one apartment to another, from one city to another, as was my wont as soon as a place had exhausted its spell, I would carry the cabinet by hand, a shroud draped over it like a cage of a sleepless parrot, which only served to elicit the curiosity of each passerby on the street. I would install the box in its own stand and immediately rearrange the items by different taxonomies according to the usual order: age, size, color, organic, or manufactured by human labor, but also by systems cutting to the heart of the issue with greater quickness, objects that contain sadness, objects that over time would change shape, objects that should not exist, objects that could not be destroyed. But one day the cabinet, which had been built as a portal for my imagination, quite inexplicably metamorphosed into a museum of dead things. The erratic pulsations emanated a diffuse color that recalled sea glass or simply inert. The suddenness of the change was baffling, but I feared I had robbed them of their special power by handling each with too great a frequency, like the dials of a shortwave radio. To this day, I still feel deep within me a glittering but inaccessible and lost radiance that grows with its distance from my current life, but the use value of this knowledge is as limited as Vermeer's sunlight. That afternoon, I sat in a wing-backed chair facing the cabinet, feeling the sun's falling fire on my back, reduced to feeling a benumbed speculation. Then, as the hour reached the mysterious moment when dusk filling the room is exactly balanced by twilight settling over the cobblestone street, I rose up to walk the eyelid curve of the port in incurably by the converted shipyards where at night theater and restaurant patrons departed for the trams as if inside a well-lit belief system that could carry them safely beyond the hills. I knew no one within 900 kilometers, and as often happens when this terrible realization is visited upon me, I found myself lost in the labyrinth of my own thoughts, watching the sailboats drifting in the dark harbor like ideas worth admiring. It was then I remembered an elderly man wearing a waistcoat I had once approached on a park bench in London some 10 years prior, having just come from Temple Church, where the young choristers draped in their scarlet cassocks had turned into small flames as pollution gathered in the clouds at sunset. In my memory, he looked like Mr. N, the owner of a coop of carrier pigeons from my childhood town. He raised the birds in the attic of his Edwardian mansion as a hobby after his wife had died of inoperable bone cancer, because he felt their honing instinct was a perfect metaphor for the human heart. He would drive to the furthest reaches of town, sometimes deep into the Bavarian countryside, always a different route in hopes of confusing the birds to test their fidelity, and then upon securing a empty scroll to their leg, to the ribbon or strands of his own hair, if the ribbon had run out, he would release them into the day, only to drive home slowly, for he wanted them to wait for him as if he were the one who had flown away. When I confronted the man to inquire if he was indeed who I thought he was, he replied he had once resided in the same town, but as to being a hobbyist with pigeons, he was clueless as to what I was speaking about, stating he found the tale odd but charming. Wondering if I myself may not have inadvertently invented the story and not wishing to be dismissed immediately, I asked if he had any recollection of me as a boy from the local orphanage. He said no, but regardless of the wave of his hand, invited me to take a seat next to him. The sum of our solitudes, we remained through the evening while the London eye stared hypnotically from its pupilless center at the spires of Westminster, the Cleopatra's Needle, the crows floating in the air as if nowhere were worth landing. and at us as we sat there unable to move while a line of snow settled in a hushed circle at our feet. That night back in Copenhagen, I hailed a car, a warm glow on the taxi driver, and from his meter the knowledge that even in stillness time was passing. Out the back window, the narrow canyon began to move again, receding into the night like the ending of a melancholy film. A light rain falling, the car gathering speed on an incline never noticed before, a momentum that pushed me gently against the seat. And I could not see the driver in the darkness, and I wondered if he were still behind the wheel, or if it even mattered as water whipped off the windshield in little rivulets into which people melted, sidewalks awash in color, and then miraculously, pedal, pedal, pedal in a blur. And I was a blur as well, only I could not see I was hurtling through the world. Thank you.